Here are 3 ways where you can help the Black Dog Chronicles to grow. Please like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to push the notification bell as well. And most importantly, share this with your friends. Share a link on your favorite social media and let your friends know why you think they'd enjoy it too. Would you like to have the next story dedicated to you? Here's how that can happen. Leave a comment in the comment field below. The comment that gets the most likes will receive a dedication in the next video. So, what are you waiting for? And now, on with the story. Red Berries Rising in the Stars. Written and read by Hugh Carr. Rowan stood on the broad expanse of volcanic rock that, in the generation since his last visit, had not surrendered to the surrounding gum trees. His childhood peers had called it flat rock. He had never noticed before how, in the finding of names, children and astrophysicists were alike. Both named their discoveries aptly and without pretension. The expansion of the universe from its homogeneous and infinitely hot crucible to its 13 3/4 billion year journey towards cold heat death was summarized by his profession in 2 words. The Big Bang was not hidden in Greek, megale ikrixi, or Latin, magna dilatatio, but in plain English that any 4-year-old could easily understand. Likewise, the great shelf of basalt below his feet that, if you pressed your ear to it, had once seemed to carry the sounds of human voices from the campgrounds below, also had its magic contained within a pair of simple words: flat rock. Now, the earth that he stood on was silent. Returning to Australia after 5 years of chasing researching projects from Hawaii to Chile, Rowan found himself confined by the country he had thought he had left behind for good. The fall of 2 towers in a city he had never seen left a worldwide shadow of fear and a retracting sense of wonder. Alone with his children on the grey-green crescent of a mountain in the brown surround of the Strathbogie Ranges, he had come to say farewell to a troubled year. In that time, he had had the last scrap of his project's funding pulled, his visa revoked, and any hope of returning dashed. Although it was not his nation that had rejected him, he resented his retreat. He had been exiled home. All the connections and bonds that he had fashioned in his life abroad had been severed. They flapped, loose and flailing in a hot northern wind. It was time to learn how to bind them down again. So he gathered his children and drove north on an impulse, retracing his way to the mountain that had nursed him through the freezing mornings and blistering days in every summery holiday of his school-age life. The city had crackled in the revision mirror beneath gathering storm clouds. In the afternoon they stopped at Euroa's service station, where the cook honored the memory of the region's bushrangers by robbing Rowan of the taste of his steak in a shotgun blast of pepper. He had lived in parts of the world where street signs ranged from the deceptive to the non-existent. But here the rust-speckled name of the mountain greeted him like a familiar page of a family photo album. Halfway up the track, the eroded gully in the middle of the road became so cavernous that they abandoned the car to continue on foot to the summit. He smiled as he remembered the days when Australian cars were undaunted by the bush, and utes with trays filled with bouncing, beltless children scattered the wallabies to their undiscovered, gum-dimmed recesses. Morgan, his youngest, slashed at the sharp blades of the saw hedge with a wand of crone-like stringy bark branch, oblivious to the congregations of common brown butterflies that waited for the sun among the listless, hanging streamers of brown on the northern side of the trees. Jamie, his eldest, looked tentatively at every tussock and tumble of tree-cast shapes, fearing phantom spiders and snakes. In the film reel of his mind, he saw himself at Jamie's age, blundering heedlessly with his friends through the never-shadowed scrub. Back then, as he had reached to grab a branch of a fallen tree to hoist himself up onto it, the limb had snapped off mid-climb, bringing it crashing into his face. The blow brought a phantasmograph of oscillating light before his eyes, making the forest leap and retreat in a dozen fractured frames. He had first lain on the ground by necessity, the dull ache in his head drowning the laughter of his friends as they abandoned him. Shame replaced pain, but that too gave way to a belligerent desire to know if his friends cared enough about him to come back. Eventually, as he stared up at the willowy shapes of towering gums, he became mesmerized. It was as if the milky sky was the ground, and the trees were colossal pillars that stretched towards him from a shapeless, primordial grey void. The fog in his head cleared, and the world righted itself, but the trees took on new shape. Their tall forms became spindly giants, swaying and observing. Unlike the titans of European myth, they chose not to crush him. They were content only to watch. In time he had returned to camp, where his swollen face and dented pride were met with calmness, a cursory check and suggestion of rest. Heads were gently shaken, and eyes rolled at the fact that, left alone with nothing but stationary trees, he had still managed to run into one. What had changed since that time when the bush was seen as a roaming ground, rather than a waiting inferno, a menagerie of crawling, killing things, and a ravenous devourer of fragile, overprotected childhood? When Jamie had broken an arm in primary school in an overzealous game on the monkey bars, the previously closed circle of mothers had surrounded Rowan, anxiously wondering if he was going to prosecute. "The school or the monkey bars?" he had half-jokingly replied. The circle closed again, leaving him outside it. All the times he had slipped off alone into the forest, escaping camp duties and endless preaching services, never to be called for frantically by a parent who had assumed the worst. Yet he wondered now if his own parents had intentionally issued a passport for freedom, or rather that the haven they were creating was for them. Had his summers of liberation been isolation and banishment instead? His own father, absent always from the marker points of his childhood, hiding away in workplace and under-the-house workshop, did not appear emblazoned on the landscape of his memory. Mealtimes in his family home were spent competing with the box at the end of the table, where conversations flowed strictly in the space between the goodies and Doctor Who. A pew was shared in silence on a Sunday. The only other times his father was alone with him was in his room, accompanied by his belt, to administer the discipline that no one but a lapsed pacifist could bring upon the heathen flesh of their own child. Looking back into the darkness of his father's living room, he watched the only family activity he had enjoyed. Somewhere behind the dust-moted conical beam of the slide projector, his father stood, clacking the small photographic frames into the hot light. Images of all the camps gone by slid into place and were met with the same commentary and quips. Even then, Rowan had noticed that the triumvirate of him and his brothers, when captured, appeared in twos or as one alone. Yet the projected photos of grey-pitted boulders coated with dry moss on which his time-frozen limbs clambered stood out sharper and more iridescent than the muted shapes before him now. As Rowan gazed between the saplings that erased the space where the tin and canvas dormitories had once stood in 3 curving lanes, the phantoms of friends and happy memories whispered from parentless capsules of the past. Even the 2 largest structures in the camp had left no sign of their passing. The dining hall, heated on freezing nights by an oil drum fire, and where on hot days the children clustered around an ever-full cask of cordial, heedless of the mosquito larvae that squirmed within. Gone, too, was the church, where neon lights had hummed and summoned all the night-born moths of the mountain. He was a child of a worship house without walls, open to the land wounded by its cult of eternal ownership, and a God who dwelt not in, but beyond the world. 20 years and more had passed since he had played, sang, and longed beneath these trees. On this very slope, he had first got drunk on hideous homemade ouzo, felt the electric tension of a brass strap bursting free beneath his fingers, and had first surrendered to soft flesh spread out on an improvised bed of jackets beneath the stars. Through those searing and blistering times, the trees had watched, silently soaking up the air that issued from bodies that would only abandon them. As Australians increasingly withdrew into cities and suburbs that grew faster than the fire-clean spaces could renew, who was in turn creeping back into the deserted places? Rowan may mourn for the small, insular Elysium that had once camped periodically over a span of 30 years on the shoulder of the mountain, but what of the people who had lived there, perhaps for 30,000? What had been their names for rocks, the grasses and the things that basked, fluttered, slithered, and soared? The trees that Rowan's people lazily grouped into the encompassing title eucalypt, of which the stringy bark, manna gum, and candlebark predominated, who was left to speak their ancient names? Were their real names the ribbon tree, the tall lady, and the old mother? The day darkened. The storm they had seen over the city reached the mountain in reduced slivers. The tattered shreds tumbled over the crinkled countryside and joined with the mists that arose from Healesville and Eildon, soaking up the apricot light of the setting sun. Like evaporating air snakes, they climbed high into the gum-scented sky, vanishing into the clear evening. Having arranged their sleeping bags, Rowan planted his feet and observed his children claiming the mountainside as their own. Morgan had spent the afternoon rolling blissfully down the slope, but was now quietly arranging a platter of marshmallows and other favorites, her black hair as deep as the night to come. Jamie, with sketchbook in hand, put the final touches on a broad panoramic view east over Strathbogie. She turned to face him, smiling and holding the pad for his inspection. A moment's glance showed it to be the best she had ever done. The detail seemed to hold the landscape and define it in a way his eyes or his words could never do. In its complexity of crosshatches and artful strokes, it was every bit as beautiful as the pages of calculations that waited unfinished on his study desk. His daughter's constellations were much closer to hand. Linking arms together, they lay with their backs to the earth and their eyes to the heavens. The moon was already visible in the north, rising like a great silver campfire above the red expanse of the horizon. As the ruddy gloaming faded, the marshalling flame of Mars, red like the berry of his name, found its place to dance at the left of the moon. Orion's belt and Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, joined the romp, delicately counterbalanced on either side of due east. "It's a beautiful place," Jamie said, more to the sky itself than to her father. "I was hoping that you'd like it," he replied. "I think it's where I first learned to love the stars. Then I'd go back to the city, where I couldn't see them anymore, but I always knew that they were still there waiting for me, whether I could see them or not." "What do you call this place?" He paused before he answered, almost as if the land around him bled its wisdom through his pack. He had come for a new beginning, and that was exactly what he'd been given. In between the depths of the trees, at the edge of the clearing, a dim shape slipped into already deep shadows. "We had a name for it," he said. "But what would you call it if it was yours to name?" Jamie mused, thinking of all the most beautiful names she knew. Before she could answer, Morgan spoke, the steam of her breath rising like an offering. "I'd call it Flat Rock," she said. Rowan laughed long and hard until the tears rolled from his eyes, and the waking night's lights grew bright against the velveting sky. He cast his head back and watched the year's last display of stars.